This is lecture 122D, Lenin's Legacy. We'll begin with a discussion of Lenin's last will and testament. Right after Lenin's victory at Rapallo, and immediately after he met with Michael Borodin and General Blucher about taking charge of the situation in China, that was on April 30th, 1922, he suffered the first of a series of disabling strokes that began on May 25th, 1922. In Volume 1 we discussed this, and the China business in a chapter 11 called Bolshevism Spreads to China. Anyway, Lenin was so distressed by his paralysis and depressed by his slow and never complete recovery that he asked his closest friend and associate within the party, Joseph Stalin, to supply him secretly with poison. To whom else could he turn? Stalin had supplied him with money for years and hid him in Finland in the summer and autumn of 1917. Within the party, Stalin was known to be Lenin's bodyguard. After Lenin's first stroke, Stalin had been assigned by the Politburo to be sure Lenin got the best treatment available, and Stalin was to report to them regularly about Lenin's progress in recovery. Stalin was the only person other than Krupskaya close to Lenin at this point, the only one he felt he could ask because he did not want to tell his wife. Stalin was so emotionally attached to Lenin, he told the Politburo he would rather kill himself than do this, and he asked them for guidance. That is, he didn't want to give him the poison. This is the only time of which I am aware Stalin asked anyone in the party for help and really meant it. However that may have been, they instructed Stalin to talk Lenin away from suicide. He was told to convince Lenin he could recover and still lead, although now he might need a larger and especially equipped semi-hospital room at the Kremlin. And most importantly, make Lenin realize he was still essential. Staying alive was a revolutionary act. Quote, "Explain to Ilyich that he owes it to us," unquote, said Zinoviev. Lenin never got the poison. However, he never fully recovered either. But in the latter part of 1922, Lenin's condition gradually improved and he got back to work. Then, after this December to February 1922-23 burst of energy, he had another stroke on March 7th, 1923. In fact, he probably had several more strokes on March 10th, 1923. During his brief energetic period, he had insisted on finishing the dictation of his letter to the Congress, which is what the will and testament is formally called. At any rate, in February 1923, Lenin had been feeling better and getting feisty about the low-stress environment rules that his doctors had prescribed and rules that the Politburo enforced through Stalin. Lenin became angry over this perceived attempt to control his re-entry into politics and began insisting on all kinds of reports being sent to him about virtually everything, and these reports he demanded included the most stressful issues confronting the party at that moment, among them the Transcaucasian matter. Now this certainly made sense if the chief was on his way back and getting re-involved. And Stalin complained to the Central Committee that his attempts to keep Lenin on an emotional even keel had led to, quote, "Ilyich becoming angry with me over the smallest things. This would not have happened if I had not been straddled with this impossible mission. I insist you relieve me of this responsibility. Let him have whatever he likes. This has been going on for, 9 months now, and it is a constant struggle with a suicidal patient. Let the doctors handle him directly if they can, and let him do as he likes. Let's face it, when he feels well enough, he wants to lead, and he resents me trying to stop him, and I can't blame him. He's going to get re-involved when he feels up to it, and we just have to live with that. Let him have whatever he wants," unquote. And this is pretty much what happened. The Central Committee insisted Stalin stay on, if it was nothing more than as a symbol of continuity in the relationship between Lenin and the rest of them. Inevitably, Lenin did not get better. Probably he was continuing to die slowly of minor strokes before the massive stroke that killed him at the end of January 1924. From day one of these strokes, he had less than 2 years to live. These strokes appear to have been rather simple high blood pressure attacks for which no one had any cure except to get blood from the circulation system. Usually, this was done in those days with hypodermic needles that sucked up blood and removed it. Earlier versions had done the same thing, such as bleeding and leeching, using leeches. Foreign doctors were called upon to help the Bolshevik doctors, but none of them could do anything other than to suggest a multitude of ways to keep his blood pressure under control. And other than physical blood removal, most of this medical advice centered keeping Lenin on an emotional, even keel. Given the conditions of the party and the Republic at that time, 1922 to 1924, this was a near impossibility. However, the Politburo insisted that happy days are here again, measures for Lenin be rigorously followed in every way. Stalin's attempts at carrying out these physician and Politburo instructions further infuriated Lenin. In fact, they led directly to and were specifically responsible for the split between these two old and dear friends. Stalin fought with Lenin's wife about the importance of keeping Lenin calm and unaware of all the problems confronting the government. Stalin went so far as to have newspapers printed in one copy only for Lenin, full of good news and whatever else Stalin thought would keep Lenin calm and happy. And it did for quite a while, at least until the boss found out. In the end, Lenin had no illusions. He accepted the fact that the party insisted he stay alive as long as possible, but he was never very happy about it. He dictated then, from December 22 through January 23, over a period of 2 weeks, his last will and testament, analyzing his party. One by one, Lenin reviewed 6 of the luminaries leading the Bolshevik Central Committee and Politburo. At that moment, on the 7-person Politburo, there were, in addition to himself, Stalin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, and Pyatakov. Stalin he found to have become too rude and impolite, and suggested some way be found of replacing Stalin with another comrade as General Secretary, a comrade who was more profile, congenial, and indeed popular. Trotsky he considered perhaps the most intellectually able of the Politburo, but far too much of the bureaucrat for his liking, and he remarked on Trotsky's legendary problem with arrogance and his earlier anti-Bolshevism. He said the greatest problem facing the party was the ongoing fight between Stalin and Trotsky, and said that inevitably the party would have to decide on whom to follow. And he reviewed one by one his other colleagues. When it was all said and done, none of those critiqued could have been very happy. Although I think it may have been unintended, Lenin's declaration at the beginning of his letter to the Party Congress that Stalin and Trotsky were the principal party leaders turned out to have the most important effect. As Lenin saw it, disunity among the party leaders was the chief problem for the Soviet Republic, now confronting the global capitalist onslaught. Achieving unity of the party and its leadership was accordingly the most important critical task confronting the party. Specifically, the first threat was the capitalist international threat. Lenin points out that the stronger socialism gets in the Soviet Republic, the more intense will be the fury of, and thus danger from, our enemies. The second greatest threat was the ongoing, seemingly internecine conflict between the party's 2 top leaders, Stalin and Trotsky. In effect, with this letter, Lenin probably sealed Trotsky's fate, for as the coming year unfolded, that is after January 1924, party cadres saw they had a choice. Lenin said in the last analysis the party would have to choose between Trotsky and Stalin, get on board with Trotsky or with Stalin. In this game, Stalin had all the incentives, and in the end, the party chose Stalin. Let's say it again. The party chose Stalin over Trotsky. Now, at any rate, Lenin gave this letter to Nadezhda Krupskaya, his wife and Central Committee member, to be read to the party leadership once he passed away. At my age of 76, I've been through a few illnesses, and I can almost feel Lenin's pain as he writes his last will and testament, and he was cranky, and justifiably so. The entire exercise turned out to be less than fruitful, perhaps for this reason. However that may have been, as soon as Lenin died on January 21st, 1924, Krupskaya turned the letter over to the Politburo. The letter was circulated to the entire Politburo, and a Politburo meeting was called to decide what to do about leadership now that Lenin was gone and given the facts of his last political will and testament. When the historic meeting was held, the Politburo concurred with what Zinoviev had to say, and that was that Lenin's fears had proven groundless about Stalin. Zinoviev said he and his colleagues knew this because they had been working on a daily and very friendly basis with Stalin since Lenin's first stroke. The Politburo decided to ignore Lenin's idea about replacing Stalin, although Stalin had offered to resign. That was not the end of it. The entire party was informed of the letter and the Politburo's subsequent decisions about its highest leaders at the upcoming 13th Party Congress on the 23rd to 31st of May of 1924. Lenin's last letter was very much on the agenda. However, the party was not about to rock the boat when everything was finally going so well. The party decided unanimously to adopt the Politburo's accepting Stalin as the top manager. Stalin gave the main report in place of Lenin at this 1924 13th Congress, as he had the year before at the 1923 12th Party Congress, held from the 17th to the 27th of April of that year, 1923. It had begun shortly after Lenin's massive strokes of March 7th to the 10th, 1923. As it turned out, Lenin had not been able to participate in that Congress, nor would he ever again participate in a party Congress. Now in 1924, every Congress participant must have sighed a concealed gasp of relief that the transition in government appeared to be going so well. Under normal circumstances, perhaps that would have been the end of the matter. However, after Trotsky was expelled from the party in 1927, he tried to make a big deal about Lenin's last will and testament. He said Lenin's idea of Stalin's personality and the desirability of replacing him had been suppressed. And that was a lie. Trotsky never mentioned that Lenin found him too bureaucratically inclined for his liking, and because that might imply that he was too much of a bureaucrat to be the party leader. Trotsky wanted Stalin to be the champion of the bureaucrats, which was the opposite of how Lenin had analyzed Stalin, and he wanted people to think his intellectual superiority should have made him the leader. He wanted people to think Lenin's testament had been suppressed, the corollary being that if the party had known of it, things would have turned out differently. He did not want people to know that Lenin had said the party would have to choose between him and Joseph Stalin. He certainly did not want people to know that the party had chosen Stalin instead of him. As you have seen, the party had learned of the testament immediately and discussed it thoroughly from the Politburo down before the 1924 Congress. How could it have been otherwise? After all, common sense tells us that with Lenin's long and trusted, closest companion and wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, having provided the letter immediately to the Politburo following Lenin's January 1924 death, it could not have been otherwise. And Trotsky never had any chance of using the army to back his ploy because the army hated him. What had occurred was the logical transfer of power from Lenin to one of his closest and original followers, who was also the man who had helped Lenin engineer the defeat of the Trotskyists in 1921 at the March Congress. End of story. Lenin and Georgia. Toward the end of 1922, Lenin began to show remarkable signs of recovery. Apparently, the low-stress environment ordered by his medical team of world-renowned physicians had worked. By the beginning of 1923, Lenin felt physically good for the first time in many months. He was more than ready to re-enter politics, but unfortunately he jumped in with both feet against the doctor's orders, and on March 7, 1923, he had another massive stroke which left him by the 10th permanently without speech and partially paralyzed. He had less than 11 months to live. Now, in the weeks before, when Lenin's health had appeared to be on the rebound, he had jumped into the politics of the moment, and one of the first things he addressed was the completion of the plan to unify the various Bolshevik governments in the former Tsarist Empire's national groups into one unified government, a government recognizing the equality and autonomy of many of the nationalities previously suppressed by the Tsarist regime. Now, Lenin and Stalin had agreed about how to proceed in this matter in the period preceding Lenin's first stroke in the spring of 1922. This stroke then occurred in the midst of a great deal of internal party debate about how to proceed with the former Tsar's territories. One of the disputes was about how the Transcaucasian republics were to be incorporated. These three republics were Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. Now initially there had been a dispute because the first party plan in Moscow was to have all three in one Transcaucasian republic. That republic would be incorporated into the Russian Soviet Socialist Federation as opposed to being equal members in a Soviet Union with Russia, the Ukraine, and three others. Stalin had argued the case every way and then acceded to Lenin's plan and discarded his own. In the end, Stalin agreed with Lenin's design where each of these republics would be taken into the new Soviet Union as equal partners. However, as long as the party insisted on the monopoly of power over the Soviet government it now had, then the real center of power and decision-making would always be in the party structure, because the party operated the command government and its economy. For practical purposes, by the time of Lenin's disabling illness, that meant the real center of power lay in the person and the concomitant personality of Joseph V. Stalin. On top of all this argument about the shape of the future Soviet Union, there had arisen an ancillary problem. Stalin's longtime bosom buddy from the years of organizing oil field workers in Georgia, and as a general in command of the Red Army forces liberating Georgia, was Sergei Erzhanikins. Now Erzhanikins had gotten into a fist fight with the leader of the opposing group of communists in Georgia. That is, a fight with those communists opposed to the idea of being subordinated first into a Transcaucasian Federation and subordinated again in the proposed incorporation into the Russian Socialist Federation as opposed to a union of all independent republics. Lenin became upset about this fistfight, as well as the way the entire Transcaucasian project had unfolded, and he blamed Stalin, whom he had made Commissar of Nationalities, for not having prevented this. However, until Stalin gave up his 19-hour-a-day, 365-day-a-year work schedule, his decisions on these and all other matters would continue to prevail, if for no other reason than he was doing, or at least supervising, virtually all of the work of the government. This is not to mention his supervision of the Red State, that is the Cheka and the Army and the Navy. A rule to note in your study of Soviet history is that Stalin always persevered because he outworked everyone else. Whatever might have happened had Lenin not had this final disabling March 7, 1923 stroke, we will never know. My own feeling is that the two, Lenin and Stalin, would have worked things out between them, as they always had before, and because Stalin always capitulated to Lenin in the end. Latter-day Trotskyists have for many decades made an issue out of Lenin's activity in the few weeks he had of lucidity at the end of 1922 and the beginning of 1923. For whatever it's worth, I think this entire Trotskyist after-the-fact business to have been a lot of playing politics nonsense. The earth belongs to the living, and those of you with an interest may draw more profound conclusions once tackling the matter. I mention it here because the Georgian affair has been one of the arrows in the quiver of anti-communist Trotskyism. Therefore, you cadre need to know what was really going on, and this is my take on the matter. Make up your own mind. And we're going to conclude with The Death Watch Begins. Note on Lenin's illness. After March 10, 1923, written by Moshe Lewin. Quote, the paralysis on the right side of the body and the loss of speech that occurred on 10 March 1923 seemed so alarming that the government decided to reveal the seriousness of the illness. From then on, Izvestia published a daily health bulletin. On May 15th, Lenin was moved from his apartment in the Kremlin to his country house in Gorky. 2 months later, in July 1923, a miracle seemed to have occurred. Lenin's health began to improve again. He began to take walks and to practice writing with his left hand. He was even able to visit the chairman of the local Sovkhots and spend 3 days with him. About August 10th, 1923, he was allowed to write. He received Pravda every day and later Izvestia and other publications. Before long, he was able to read books and had a reading list drawn up for him. It was usually Krupskaya who read him newspaper articles and passages from the books he asked for. He was far from completely cured. It was all the more astonishing that he managed to get permission for the journey he undertook on October 18, 1923. He traveled to Moscow, went to the Kremlin by car, and then set off again to wander the streets and to visit the agricultural exhibition. He then went back to his office, remained silent for a long time, took out some books from his library, and returned to Gorky. Now, between November 24th and December 16th, Bukharin, Preobrazhensky, Skvortsov, Stepanov, Kostinsky, Piatnitsky, and the editor of Kasadaya Nov, Voronsky, came to see him. They talked to him about current affairs and brought news that Lenin listened to attentively, but he does not seem to have recovered the use of speech. The chronology contained in volume 35 of the collected works, which mentions the loss of speech, does not return to the matter later. At the beginning of 1924, Lenin attended a Christmas party organized at the Sovkhoz on January 19th in a sledge. He followed a hunting expedition in the forest, but between January 17th and 20th, his time was mainly taken up with reading the report of the 13th Party Congress. Now, Lenin appeared very attentive and sometimes asked questions. By gestures, certain points quite obviously irritated him. But Krupskaya managed to calm him, perhaps by inventing information for the purpose. On January 21st, 1924, Lenin's health suddenly deteriorated and he died at 6:50 p.m. That comes from the book Moshe Lewin wrote, Lenin's Last Struggle, published in 1974. Dead Man Walking. Lenin finished in politics May 25, 1922. Whether he was paralyzed in bed or dead in his mausoleum, Lenin was finished in politics the day of his first stroke on May 25, 1922. After that, he was never more than a living and then dead symbol. Whether it was the bullets fired into his brain by the left SR crackpot Fanya Kaplan in 1918 that was the ultimate cause, or simply inherited or acquired hypertension responsible, we will never know. What we do know is that Lenin never played any role other than ceremonial after his first stroke. If it had to happen, it's a good thing it didn't happen until the spring of 1922, because the party was very confident by that time with all the great things finally breaking. For example, the end of the Civil War and the subsequent domestic conflict, then the withdrawal of the last imperialist troops, Japanese, 70,000 of them, then the Treaty of Rapallo, then the China strategy, the first good harvest, and the preparation for unification of the Bolshevik republics. The Bolsheviks were able to move on as if nothing untoward had happened. The fuss instigated by Trotsky over what might have happened had Lenin not suddenly exited politics was irrelevant. The party should have been ready. It could not forever count on the one Superman who had taken them and all working people farther than anyone else in 6,000 years. It was time to grow up, and the party proved that it had. For better or for worse, the future of mankind was now in the hands of the party Lenin created, built, and had placed in power. It would never again be in his personal hands. The right way versus the wrong way of looking at things, two perspectives on our situation in 1924. Now, much has been said over the last century about the primitive nature of the first country in which we seized power. Sometimes this conversation takes the turn of implying that the entire thing was a mistake to begin with, since Russia had no chance of becoming the whole homeland of the world socialist stage once supporting revolutions failed. That is the wrong way of looking at things. The right way of looking at our historic role in making history is that this is exactly the kind of situation that justifies our existence as communists. If history were to resolve everything itself in the proper way, from our perspective, then why would we need to intervene at all? This scientific insight and foresight of Marxism is not at all the same as Cromwellian predestination, where every step taken by every person is imagined to be preordained or predestined by God. Our insight is predictive and powerful because, as in any science, when it is learned, understood, and applied, our insight becomes our secret weapon. We are not along for the historical ride. Those of you who may be should find another line of work. We communists intervene precisely because we understand the laws of history. We can speed up an otherwise interminably and possibly fatally slow adaptation of an otherwise unguided, unthinking humanity. A fictional analogy would be Harry Seldon and his Science of Psychohistory in the Isaac Asimov Foundation series of novels. The fact that we did not have the ideal conditions for evolving by revolution from capitalism to communism is irrelevant. It is actually proof that we were and are needed to get this process of transition from capitalism kicked in the ass and working in one of the possible real-world scenarios. That is what free will means in the real world. The job is far from done, but the road forward is clear thanks to the successful experience of Bolshevism in China. The 19th Congress of the Communist Party of China makes it clear that the leadership of the international working class movements has found a permanent home in Beijing. Rule number 1, an elite revolutionary leadership that has created its own Leninist party can do the kind of ass-kicking that we advocate. A party that is committed to mobilizing the massive proletarians for revolutionary action against our class enemies and their dictatorships, and to do so in a new way. Rule number 2, remember, no matter what form their dictatorship takes, whether as a dictatorship with bourgeois parliamentary democratic trappings or outright fascist, it is still nothing but a victorious dictatorship of an enemy social class. It must be liquidated in its entirety, root and branch. Rule number 3. Our cap enemies are clear when they are undisguised. They also come in the form of modern revisionism, Trotskyism, anarchism, and syndicalism. Beware of these traps, as well as the imperialist armed camps. Our situation in January 1924, when Lenin died, is as follows. Our biggest problem at the beginning of the year of 1924 were 1. The destruction of what had existed of a genuine industrial Russian proletariat. What hard times and war had not done to their numbers had been done to workers by our leadership, as it called out workers again and again to be the essential, self-sacrificing shock troops in one or another critical battle during the Civil War. And 2, even our best class-conscious workers were often too uneducated to run the factories in which they worked. Needless to say, 3, the would-be petty bourgeois capitalist farmers who were emerging from a domesticated feudal peasantry were useless to our immediate social needs. These primitive farmers were totally uneducated and 100% illiterate. They had been herded as a mass of domesticated farm animals for at least 200 years and were not capable of performing any function other than that of wooden plow, semi-Neolithic farming, at least for that moment. Except to be soldiers, we could and did teach them to fight and die for our revolution. 4. Consequently, we had to rely increasingly on a highly centralized body of elite Bolshevik commanders everywhere, from the army to industry. This is the origin of the nomenklatura system, where every party leader is vetted and chosen from above. 5. The old urban petty bourgeoisie recognized we were here to stay and decided that joining us was preferable to being killed by us. Besides, it was the only way upward in the new social order. This was changing the nature of the party itself, as incoming new members swamped old Bolsheviks. And 6th, there were only so many positions to be filled in both the government and the Army and Navy. If bourgeois specialists of the old regime were needed, and thus given some of these jobs, that was that much less of a limited job pool available for loyal, self-sacrificing old Bolshevik cadre. The friction between the bourgeois specialists and the party members, thus institutionalized, turned out to be one of the most difficult of the inherent problems confronting the party as it struggled to create the capitalist industrial infrastructure the party should have inherited. 7. The command nature of party operations that began with the seizure could not now be changed, since the party was running everything in the country. Now, how this might be democratized to encourage maximum participation of the working masses in the future was something that 8, as Lenin said, we don't know how to do. He said that at the 11th Party Congress in 1922. In fact, it could not be done for decades. And this was the general crisis of the Stalinist socialist stage. These are just a few of the conundrums that confronted us in January and February of 1924 once we had seized power in such a primitive place. And however, comrades, that is what we're here for. Now we must do our best to accelerate history along the lines we wish to follow. Part of that is periodic theoretical review to see where we are and perhaps therefore where we may be going. Because we have literally the science of society and culture and their history as our sole property. We have a great leg up to begin with, therefore. We know what we're doing, and they do not, except in that limited quarterly perspective mentality they live by. One main conclusion is that the immediate transitional period between capitalism and communism has featured in real-world practice the emergence of an entirely new stage in the socio-cultural evolution of humanity. We are currently analyzing that stage, called the stage of Stalinist socialism, a distinct stage in the socio-cultural evolution between capitalism and communism, and this time, however, in China. And it's probably just one of several such distinct socio-cultural evolutionary stages between capitalism and communism that together comprise the second transitional period. Now, going back to 1924 and making NEP work. When Lenin died at the end of January of 1924, he left behind, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, a vast industrial espionage organization. This organization had its primary emphasis on stealing the otherwise unavailable industrial secrets of Germany, Italy, and France, with smaller operations in the smaller capitalist countries ranging from Iberia to Eastern Europe, and eventually to the industrial complex of the USA. These industrial secrets would normally have been available to other capitalists in other countries willing to pay licensing fees. However, the European capitalist world had agreed on a program of total denial of industrial process data to the Soviet Republic, unless it was purchased with cash up front, and then if it was not technology that would make the Soviet Republic and its army any stronger. Now, neither Lenin nor Stalin intended to allow foreign capitalists to strangle the revolution. Modernizing Soviet industry would, of course, greatly empower the Soviet government, so it was natural and to be expected that the international great capitalist families would continue to deny their technology to global Bolshevism. Stalin explained all of this in his 1924 book, Foundations of Leninism, and that book itself was presaged by Lenin in his last letter to the Party Congress, where he started out saying so. At the center of this great international industrial espionage program of the Cheka's Economic Directorate was Stalin's favorite Chekist Lev Feldman, codenamed Alexander Orlov. First in Italy and then in Germany, Orlov recruited thousands of intellectual agents and sent them into the war industries of these two imperialist countries. Eventually, all of this German-Italian work would be headquartered in Switzerland. This German and Italian industrial espionage was codenamed the Red Orchestra. It may have numbered 100,000 by the time Orlov was finished constructing. Inside snapshot, Richard Sorge becomes a master of deceit, New Year's Day, 1925. And it begins this way. I thought I'd get some work done while this place is relatively quiet, but there's no need for you to be working today, Molotov. That's Stalin speaking. And Molotov replied, Koba, I think we might catch up on a personnel matter for a few minutes, and then if you'll excuse me. Do you have time? Sure, why not? Now, catching up time is what it is, so what's the problem? It's not a problem, the opposite perhaps. I have a new German assigned to Comintern Intelligence, and I think you will find it useful to speak with him. I see an agent of enormous potential. He's outside Koba just in case you had the time to speak with him. If you don't, he will certainly understand, and is somewhat embarrassed anyway to be asked to come at all. Show him in, Vlad, and eventually I'll read that file you're carrying. I presume it's his. Yes, it is. Here it is. To outline verbally what's in the summary, it essentially says that he was a German soldier from the intellectual petty bourgeoisie for the Kaiser's capitalist regime. He was interned for a while on the Russian front, and after the war he was returned to Germany. After his discharge, he worked his way into what became our German Communist Party. He was exceptionally well regarded and was assigned as an armed guard for our delegates to the Comintern Conference in Berlin last year. Otto Kuusinen, the Bolshevik chief in Finland, recommended him for Comintern Intelligence, so it came to you as the chief of Comintern Intelligence, that is to say to my desk, and I endorsed the recommendation. He arrived last week. Sorga, right? Yes, Koba, how did you know? Well, you told me, Vlad, last week, or was it Otto? Molotov was searching his memory. He must have mentioned it in one of the briefings. On the other hand, Kuusinen had been there. All right, that's enough. He speaks Russian, I take it. Very well for a German. Show him in. This will give me a little New Year's Day off time, which I richly deserve after this last year, starting out as it did with the death of Illich. Fortunately, we got a break in the harvest. The imperialists are all too busy at home dealing with their own workers to worry about us, so we bought enough time to get this country reorganized. Yes, show him in. Now, even taking into account Koba's affection for Alexander Orlov, it was Richard Sorga who was to become more the master's pet than any other single agent in the history of Red Intelligence. Stalin spent a great deal of time with Sorga during the 1920s and continued to do so in the years immediately preceding his dispatch to Tokyo. In the end, the time Comrade Stalin invested in his pupil proved to be more than worth it. Sorga's penetration of the Japanese imperial staff at the crucial time of their preparation for war with the Soviet Union in the summer of 1939 and later in the summer of 1941 as the Nazis were heading for Moscow would have been more than worth the time and effort in and of itself. After the Nazi invasion in June of 1941, Sorga would provide the boss with the accurate knowledge Stalin needed to have. That was about Japanese intentions on socialism's eastern frontier. Stalin had to know this in order to know what to do next in the war against Germany on the western frontier. In the first case, Stalin prepared a counteroffensive of a special type and along with his hand-picked general George Zhukov, smashed permanently Japan's hopes to succeed in the Soviet East. The matter was decided in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, where the Japanese suffered their first smashing defeat of World War II in August 1939, and in case of the Great Battle of Moscow in December 1941, Sorga's spying on the Japanese imperial staff allowed Stalin to transfer Zhukov's Siberian armies for the counterattack at Moscow on December 5, 1941, thereby inflicting the first smashing defeat on the Nazis of World War II. It all had started for Richard Sorga on New Year's Day 1925, barely 11 months since Lenin's death, down the hall from Stalin's Staraya Street office. Actually, it was a very large suite of offices and libraries that took up half of the top floor in the building, which was a Moscow City block in size. The other half of the top floor was where the intelligence division of the Comintern had its general staff offices, along with the Russian Party Secretariat. Lesser bureaus spread out all over the city from there, depending on space availability and need to be close to the boss, or lack thereof. Stalin used his Kremlin suite of offices mainly for ceremonial purposes, and he had a cot in the former maid's quarters there, where he often spent the 5 hours he allotted himself for sleep. Otherwise, he worked every day of the year. Robbing the rich to help the poor, Stalin loves being Koba. At any rate, Stalin had taken interest in Sorga from his first day at staff headquarters. He let Felix Dzerzhinsky know he would run Sorga personally. This was fine with the Cheka chief, who was used to Stalin's preference for direct management in some cases and had his hands full anyway. Sorga's first assignment from the boss was to contact the dead Tsar's uncle, now in exile, and other Tsarist parasites in exile. Sorga was to facilitate their further financial contributions to the Mokr treasury, that's spelled M-O-C-R, capital letters, so it could continue and step up the great anti-Bolshevik struggle. If the boss had a weakness, it was his continuing desire to rob the aristocrats of everything they had, a way, I suspect, of ameliorating the pain he felt over the death of his first wife by poverty. At any rate, and of course all these Tsarist bosses had no idea that at the head of their great organization was one of Joseph Stalin's closest friends, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the proprietor of this real-world Bates Motel, alternatively what I like to call the Mokr Roach Motel. And a few comments about it. Since the winding down of the Civil War and re-establishment of law and order inside the Republic and Union, the Cheka had succeeded in getting a grip on the White Guard. These conspirators aimed to overthrow Bolshevism and restore the Tsarist monarchy. For many years, the Cheka had infiltrated their best licensed-to-kill agents into the white emigre outfits from Poland to Paris and all points in between. The Bolsheviks had actually created what the White Guard operators thought was their organization. It was called MOCR, or Monarchist Organization for Central Russia. The survivors of the Romanov dynasty were among its highest leaders, as were many of the Tsar's generals, left over from their Civil War defeats, now in exile. Money from the coffers of these persons and their supporters flowed into the Cheka's umbrella organization. Its real purpose, however, was to round up all of the monarchist opponents of the revolution into one enemy that would be liquidated according to plan. Checking into the Roach Motel were all the Tsar's diehards. Checking out was problematic. One after the other, all of the Mokr's leaders eventually had accidents, were kidnapped, or simply disappeared. One after the other, all of its projects eventually came to naught, for apparent bad luck reasons. Yet the Mokr seemed always ready to pick up and get started all over again. Why? Because its top organizers were actually Chekas. A real-world Norman Bates, Felix Dzerzhinsky, continued to run the Roach Motel with the full confidence of the Tsar's still-living relatives and biggest bureaucrats. The trick had 3 years yet to run in January of 1925. Then its leaders would finally discover the comedy to which they had devoted nearly a decade of their anti-Bolshevik lives. By that time in 1928, whatever they might have accomplished against the Soviet government in its weakest period was a long-lost dream never to be resuscitated. Many lakes were full of many bodies. The Cheka had done it again and disarmed the most dangerous enemies of the international working-class movement long before they could fire their first shots. The Roach Motel strategy had worked perfectly and would work repeatedly in the future, and others would learn the lesson as well. Now, just a few comments on the tripartite defense strategy, and we'll conclude with this lecture. By New Year's Day of 1925, Lenin, not dead not quite yet 1 year, that is since January 21st, 1924, when he actually died, witnessed his successors finding themselves confronting a world where the proletarian revolution was surrounded by the capitalist encirclement. Somehow, the Soviet Union would have to be modernized while the Bolsheviks waited for workers in the advanced capitalist countries to join in the worldwide socialist revolution. This was a realistic strategy because Bolsheviks had built temporary but strong defenses, and that defense was tripartite. Number one, Rapallo had split the capitalist alliance in the West. Number two, the Mokr had collected the Bolsheviks' feudal capitalist opposition in Russia, dropping them into a killing bottle. And now three, the sincere Chinese reformist bourgeoisie of Sun Yat-sen would be put into place to protect the eastern frontiers of the Soviet Union. Strangely enough, the latter began in London, where Soviet Secret Service Cheka agent Michael Borodin had been sent to try and put order into the council movement there from a Bolshevik perspective back in 1920. In August of that year, Borodin had succeeded in welding the disparate Marxist groups of Great Britain into one authorized Comintern party. the Communist Party of Great Britain emerged. Borodin would subsequently return several times, and a year later would organize a massive national strike movement. And that brings us to a conclusion of 4 lectures on the Bolshevik Revolution. And next time in the next set of lectures, we're going to be discussing the construction of Bolshevism in the construction of socialism in Russia and in the entire Soviet Union.